In this recording, I want to take a look at some articles from the Dallas Morning News, April 1963, because if you look at the events of the Kennedy assassination and the events leading up to it and concentrate on specific issues, then you can ask new questions that are worthy of being asked and answered. These questions do not have anything to do with conspiracy, but they do have to do with Oswald's motivation, which has never been satisfactorily explained. There are so many possible reasons that Oswald would have decided to shoot President Kennedy, but getting to the set of factors that were actually at work, or the single factor, if there was just one factor, is a difficult thing to do. But this article here is from the Dallas Morning News, April 11th, page 1, and this reports on Oswald's attempt to assassinate General Walker. Now, of course, nobody knew that Lee Harvey Oswald was the one who shot at Walker on April 11th, except for Oswald's wife, Marina. Certainly the Dallas Morning News didn't know, but we do know that Oswald did it because he told his wife, even before the news got out into the papers. And of course, he came home on April 10th in a state of shock and later explained everything to Marina. But in this article, we learn a couple of things. First of all, we learn that the shot just barely missed Walker, something we've known for a long time, of course. And we also know that the police thought that there was some kind of suspicious car in the neighborhood, and that those were the people who committed the assassination attempt against General Walker. And this news particularly interested Oswald because he thought it showed how incompetent the police were. And I think we can infer that once Oswald was over his disappointment with not carrying out the assassination of Walker successfully in his mind, he thought that he had been successful in foiling the police. And he expected to continue to be successful in foiling the police. And I think he took that attitude with him when he attempted to assassinate JFK. He did not believe that the police could necessarily catch him. That's, of course, speculation, but there is a good deal of evidence that Oswald tried to convert his failure into success by emphasizing things like this: the Dallas police wrongly identifying a suspicious car in the neighborhood. Another interesting thing about this is at the very end of the article, Walker says, "When I saw the hole in the wall," he said, "I went upstairs and got my gun, then went outside to take a look. I didn't see anybody, so I went back in the house and notified police." Well, that's very, very important because this is one of the reasons why Oswald escaped. If Walker had called the police immediately, Oswald might have been caught because it only took about 2 minutes for a policeman to show up at Walker's home. And Oswald had to bury his rifle, and he had to somehow get to a bus stop, and he might have been seen. We can't know that for sure, of course, but it does appear that Walker did things out of order if the goal of Walker was to capture Oswald and not just rely on himself. Now, this article was the very next day. It's really the only other article that you can find in the Dallas Morning News on the search for the would-be assassin of Edwin Walker. It seems that the police ran out of leads and the newspaper had nothing more to report after this. Once again, this article reports on a series of speculations about who was suspicious in the area, including that late model car that had already been identified as a suspicious car, even though that had nothing to do with the assassination attempt, as it turned out. and there's a bit more information about the attempt itself. Nothing in this article really adds any meaningful information that would raise new questions in our minds about Oswald's assassination attempt on Walker. Now we come to a very interesting article. This was published on April 21st, a few weeks later, in the Dallas Morning News. This was on a Sunday, and we know a great deal about what Oswald was doing on the Sunday when this paper came out. Like all Sundays, of course, Oswald did not have to go to work. And we know from Marina that he spent a great deal of time that morning combing through this particular edition of the Dallas Morning News. And as he was reading, he became quite agitated, according to Marina, and he sprang from his chair and he left the newspaper folded at the front page with this particular article face up where Marina could see it. Now, that doesn't mean that he did this in order to show it to Marina surreptitiously, but Marina wondered that many times later. And of course it says Nixon calls for a decision to force Reds out of Cuba. And it was a slashing attack, according to the newspaper article, by the former Vice President, Richard Nixon, on President Kennedy for his weakness against Castro. And Gene Davison, who have written excellent books on the relationship between Marina and Oswald's game in the case of the Davison book, have spotlighted this article as somehow triggering Oswald's anger because Nixon attacks Castro. Well, that's not particularly surprising, and I've always wondered why there has been so much focus on this, because many articles over the weeks and months of 1963 had people in the government and outside the government calling for Castro's removal. Why this would trigger Oswald has always been a mystery to me, and so that part of the story seemed a little bit weird here. And of course, then Marina said, Oswald went into the bathroom and came out with his pistol in his belt and practically telling her that he's going out to see Nixon because Nixon's in town. Well, that also raises a slew of questions. Because for one thing, Nixon was not in town. Nixon was addressing newspaper editors in Washington, D.C., as you can see from this dateline. And Oswald would have seen this as well, unless he was just so upset by the article that he forgot to look at the dateline. And of course that's possible. Maybe he thought Nixon was in town, but there's nothing in the article that says that. And so in my opinion, Oswald was not going to look for Nixon because he knew Nixon was not in town, but rather he was perhaps going to try to launch another attack on Walker as a way to defend Castro. Obviously, he couldn't defend Castro by attacking the president in April 1963, but he could try to make do on his plans earlier in the month and turn defeat into victory. And so, again, this is speculation, but the question still remains, why would this article trigger that? And I found something that may answer this question. I found this article in the Dallas Morning News, April 21st, page 12. This is the same newspaper that had the Nixon article that we just looked at. Same paper. It's just on page 12 instead of page 1. Nobody, until now, nobody seems to have found this article until now. U.S. decides on slayings, says Castro. The United States has abandoned plans for a second invasion of Cuba in favor of a plot to assassinate Cuban leaders, Premier Fidel Castro said in a speech early Saturday. Now, this article predates the famous article in September 1963, published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, where Castro was interviewed and issued a veiled threat against President Kennedy, saying that if the Kennedy administration continues to sponsor assassination attempts against Castro, that U.S. leaders themselves will not be safe, as Castro put it. Well, many people have speculated that Oswald saw that article, and I agree. He probably did see the article, and it may have given him an idea to try to help Castro by targeting Kennedy, although, of course, at that time, Oswald had no reason to know that he would be given a chance to do that in just 2.5 months. But it is reasonable to speculate that Oswald did see that famous article, which many people think gave him the first inkling that the Kennedy administration was trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. Well, that's not true because of this article. It defies belief that Oswald would have missed this article. Remember, he spent 2 hours reading this paper, this very edition, on the morning of Sunday, April 21st. He had all the time in the world. This is on page 12. I'm sure he read the Nixon article on page 1. But if anything was going to trigger him, it would be this particular article. And one of the questions that people have raised, and that I raise, is why has this article not seen the light of day? And I think the best explanation is that the FBI, which was charged with poring through the Dallas Morning News, and which found the Nixon article, probably found this article as well. But they did not have any reason to spotlight the fact that Oswald could have known of government plans to assassinate Fidel Castro, because that would make the FBI look bad for not tracking Oswald down. You remember that Oswald was on the FBI's radar in 1962 and 1963. And they tried to interview him. They did interview him on 2 occasions, but they tried to interview him on more than 2 occasions. And if the FBI could have known this, but which they surely could have because it's in the newspaper, they should have stepped up their attempts to interview Oswald, not because they knew that he was capable of violence, but because they knew he had a communist background. And this was just one more piece of evidence that some people would think they should have known about as early as April 1963. So, to make a long story short, it's possible that the FBI saw this, but simply didn't report it. There were other things that they knew about Oswald, sending a note to James Hosty, the FBI man on Oswald's case, and Hosty, of course, destroyed that document, a fact that did not become known until the mid-1970s. So there were other examples of the FBI covering up things that it knew, and we don't know if this was one example of it, this article, but I can't understand why the FBI, if it saw the page 1 article, missed this one and the connection to a possible revenge act by Oswald to avenge U.S. plots against Castro. So this seems to be a particularly important article which until now has not seen the light of day.